So thank you all for joining us. We are here at the closing panel, closing keynotes. Appreciate everyone here. So what we're going to talk about is an interesting topic, net neutrality and SDN. We'll talk about zero rating and all the way to 3. And so joining me today, I have an esteemed panel of experts. We'll start with Mark Cohen from Spirent. And we have Yannis Yakomis, who is co-founder of Selfie Networks, and not that selfie that you're thinking about, the other one. Diego Lopez from Telefonica, and Klaus Martini from Deutsche Telekom. But before we start, I just want to point out that Klaus and Diego are here as themselves, as content experts.
That's it's a very delicate issue, and you have to.
Yeah, it's obviously a tricky issue, and so again, turn off those recorders. I'm kidding. But Diego and Klaus obviously have been in the industry for a long time, and they've graciously agreed to share their own perspectives here on this panel. And so we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll see where it takes us. All right, so let's start with net neutrality. Now, those in the US will obviously know it's a pretty charged word and has been the last couple of years. But certainly there's a global perspective to this, right? The world is not the US, in fact. And let's maybe start with Diego or Klaus. You can flip a coin and see who goes first. And talk a bit about perspectives on net neutrality from outside the US.
In general, the concept, my personal view is that net neutrality is the kind of concept that needs a really deep revision, because the original concept was coined in a moment in which, the situation was completely different. It was a moment in which packet networks were starting. It was important to foster the new services, etc. Right now, net neutrality, in most cases, is something that is taken as I would say, an unfair advantage for those not being obliged to be neutral. We are obliged to net neutrality. Nobody is obliged to any kind of service neutrality. When service neutrality, services are even more important than network itself. And this is something that is. I'm not saying that it's not required some degree of neutrality, because it's a guarantee for further innovation and fostering the idea of new services, and the possibility of disrupting somehow but the terms in which net neutrality is expressed right now, I would say all over the world, at least in the Western world. I don't know exactly which is the situation.
Fair.
Is something that needs a deep revision to make it a real and effective tool as it used to be in the past.
Understood. Klaus, any thoughts?
Well, I think at first we have to clarify what we mean with network neutrality in the US and outside of the US, because I think I have the feeling they have different understanding what does it mean. For sure, overall, yes, we are talking about prioritization of services, this kind of stuff. But in principle, we have different understanding based on different experience, different expectations about that one. I think that's one of the obstacles we have to discuss first before we are talking about technical implementation of this kind of stuff. It is easy in brackets, to do it in one country, or in the US, it's more than a country. But if you come to Europe and then can make a breakdown to the different countries in Europe, I think each of them have different understanding, different rules and different expectations about that one. And that makes it so complex to find a common approach for that one. I think that is something we have to consider if you're talking about that topic more in detail, if you're talking about here, for example.
Okay, fair enough. Yannis, thoughts?
Yeah, I think, we can look at a very practical example and understand, how this played. So zero rating is the practice that some applications, the traffic of certain applications is charged differently at the network, right? And it's the first widely deployed, worldwide, commercially successful service that falls under the gray zone of net neutrality, right? So just to give you some numbers, it's been active in 90 countries worldwide. More than 200 operators offer zero rating plans. 1,000 applications participate into it, and 3 billion users have access to these plans. Okay, so it's widely deployed. It's reality, is not a theoretical concept. So if we look at how different countries approach this from a regulatory perspective in terms of net neutrality, we have extremes like India that outright banned the practice of zero rating. We have countries that give operators the freedom and the capability to do whatever they want, handpick their own applications or work with Facebook exclusively to do zero rating. And then we have middle ground, like what is happening in Europe. So in Europe, and it's a very interesting use case that I think points to why we need SDN and NFV to get involved into this picture. The European regulator said, look, you can do zero rating, but you can do it on a category-based level. So you can zero rate video traffic or music traffic, but you cannot just zero rate Netflix or Spotify. And essentially, this gives a middle ground. Okay, you can try to innovate, you can do different things that users like, but make sure that this doesn't create any anti-competitive incentives for users to use certain applications, right? And what we've seen right now over the last year or so is this effort of essentially bringing the implementation closer to what the regulators want to have in practice. I think this is what is interesting from an SDN and NFV perspective, on like if there is like a certain framework in place that puts requirements into which applications can benefit from differentiated services, under what conditions, what are the needs from the network in order to meet these requirements.
Sure. Good. Excellent. So we're going to move the conversation a little bit along to SDN and NFV, but we're going to come back after Mark describes potentially SDN and NFV and the use in something like doing net non-neutrality, so to speak. Then we'll come back and say, okay, obviously it's been done in the past, and those of you can contribute on it. But then we'll go forward. But maybe let's just look at SDN and NFV, being one of the guys who were there very early in the SDN and NFV realms. So SDN and NFV as relevant to net non-neutrality, thoughts, or maybe description or definitions?
Well, net non-neutrality is implying that there's going to be traffic discrimination that would be deployed and maintained, well, depending on the arrangements, and this could vary all over the map. And traditionally, if we think back just in the recent past, there will be some level of constraints, even if there's net non-neutrality. And we've been doing traffic discrimination for quite a long time. The difference with software-defined networking is that it can be much more intelligent, it can be much more precise in terms of the scope that we want to deploy, and it also allows for some of the additional capabilities that we would need to do things like provide a more manageable service, especially for those quote-unquote preferred applications in the network non-neutrality environment. Now, this is going to require some degree of validation / characterization to understand the behavior of some of the more sensitive applications in these non-net neutrality environments where there will be a disproportionate emphasis placed on some applications versus another based on commercial and financial considerations. So for those who are trying to deploy applications that require some guarantee and service, or maybe not guarantee, but would be beneficial to run with additional performance characteristics, some pre-deployment examination is going to be really essential, and especially in the virtualized environment, because now we have to think about how the role of virtualized network functions when we start to think about NFV. Because NFV is going to be running in all sorts of different NFV infrastructure. It's going to range from CPE all the way to public cloud and everything in between. And we have to have a much better idea of what the performance considerations are in those various different NFVI instances than we might have otherwise. Because we can't always assume that it's just running in an unlimited resource or elastic public cloud.
Fair. So, all right, SDN and NFV as relevant to prioritizing traffic, but, Klaus and Diego, so obviously we had zero rating before the advent of SDN and NFV. So how do we do it then? And is it going to be better now or worse?
As Mark said, it's much more clever we can do that. It could be used for a business case.
Right.
Because this network neutrality thing, we had it in GSM already. It was only on another level.
Right.
But now there's an opportunity, if you find a business case for that, when you can do that. Is it fair? I don't know. Is it clever to earn money? It is. That is really where you're coming from, which we're interested in. And so I think that is the opportunity which you have now if you're using NFV for this network neutrality thing. And that is another option, but it's up to each company to decide, is it a business or not?
No, that's true. I mean, the technology is there. I remember some time ago we made an experiment to show that we could use SDN to build something that by that moment we called a personal VLAN. And the idea is that you have your identity. With your identity, you saw a certain set of services that others.
Personal network slicing.
Personal, yeah. Well,
modern words.
It was basically it was a VLAN. No, it didn't span beyond the LAN environment. This was LAN.
Yeah.
That's done.
Fair.
I must say, but but it's true. I mean, you can run that. You have the technology for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whether there is a clear business case for expanding that technology, that even, I mean, I must say, I mean, when we started with this and we showed that to our marketing guys, they told us, well, no, companies really don't need this. They have a clear segmentation, marketing, production, whatever, and they don't need that so fine-grained thing. We can do it.
Got it.
In some cases, it probably would imply that, well, even if in some cases that could be something that we must do it in the future because of whatever the reason. And you think about the typical emergency situations. If you can prove that you're in an emergency, why should not you get priority over where? Then, well, if you have been properly identified and you were misusing it, you will be punished. But in that moment, you require it. We can do it.
That is not you. That is more clever in this day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so it's doable. It's going far, much farther than the case now that you distinguish by IP addresses or URLs or whatever.
You have the Diego Lopez slice.
No, exactly. No. And this is a discussion I have had once and again, which is about whether there will be 5 slices in the whole network or 5 billion slices in the whole network.
Fair.
I guess it's...
So the contention is that the SDN, NFV, or even before, we already had some of these capabilities, but the business model and monetization is the challenging one, regardless.
Yeah.
I think there is like one aspect that before going into monetization comes into compliance, right? And to give you an example on where we need automation in terms of DevOps and SDN and NFV where they can help. I'm going back into what happens in Europe. So the regulator said you can do video-based or music-based. So you have one operator in Europe that has 500 music and video applications in their programs, right? And this has been driven by the fact that they automated the whole process, right? All their testing is there, they provision testing environments through APIs, they run automated scripts, and they are there. And we are actually being involved in many partnerships between application providers and mobile operators, and we can see what happens in practice. So when we compare these, we saw that they were able to onboard a new partner within 2 weeks. And when we compare with somebody else, we see it's been taking 8 months, and we still haven't had success. And what is happening in practice is that you have product managers between applications and operators exchanging Word documents with IP addresses over email, right? And so I think, in theory, yes, we can put DPI, we can detect something, but to bring this into production in an open way that is inclusive of many different applications, there are all these automation and operational mindset that we have to put in practice, which is not there yet, right? And you made the sort of differentiation between net neutrality and not net neutrality, but if you look at all the frameworks that are put in place, there are always cases and provisions that say this is acceptable as prioritization within a net neutrality framework, right? And so it's still a matter of compliance. In terms of incentives, I think what we've seen in practice is that the traffic differentiation at the data plane is the baseline on top of which you add the commercial incentives, right? And this is marketing that happens on top of it. The big driver for application providers is driving their national growth. Work with 100 operators all over the world, use their marketing engine, and drive new users. And vice versa for operators to add value to the user experience. So it's not just the low latency per se, is what comes on top of such partnerships between the two sides that makes a lot of sense from a commercial perspective.
Got it. So that makes sense. So Mark, any thoughts about this? So it sounds like we have the ability to do it, technically speaking. You didn't use the words NFV and SDN, you used the word automation to create it.
Automation, everyone agrees where is automation. Nobody agrees
I think everyone says automation is always good. SDN may be complicated. Is that right? I don't know. Mark, what do you think?
Well, SDN is going to require that you have a sense of what what is the objectives that you're trying to actually implement in the SDN control model. I mean, if there is a new set of regulatory requirements that are going to directly affect how traffic is admitted into the network or dropped in the network, then we're going to need to ensure that there is some level of enforcement, and that's going to require some level of monitoring and testing to ensure that you have some idea of what the particular goal is that you're attempting to measure against, and then what is that behavior that we're actually observing on the network in the first place. Right. And SDN in particular, it provides a lot of advantages over traditional network control models in allowing for very efficient monitoring, very granular monitoring of those traffic flows so that you can actually determine whether you're meeting the service level, either objective or service level agreement or regulatory compliance that you're subject to. And of course, again, because of the fact that it varies as my colleagues have pointed out, when you're in the U.S., outside the U.S., and various other national boundaries, we're going to need to have a range of different profiles that are going to be required to support all the different national frameworks. So SDN provides an ideal way of supporting that. And NFV comes into play by just offering the ability to mix and match VNFs that can actually do maybe some of the different functions that might be required by regulators.
The shaping, the enforcement.
Exactly. Performance optimizations or lack or
the DPI or the...
Can I give a comment to Mark? I think, Mark, you're completely right what you are saying. I think as the NFV and NFV are clever technologies.
Yeah.
It's no doubt about that one. How we use it, maybe we are not that clever as the technology gives us.
Technology is cleverer than you are. Yeah.
That is more a human thing. That's not a technology thing.
Right.
But that is a reality which we have, and that is something we have to consider if you're talking about the use of NFV and SDN in our networks. And this automation thing, everybody is talking about automation for sure. That is a given. That everybody is saying yes, we need that, but how and is it clever? The same question.
Right. Automation is something you need, right? Like more money. Everyone needs more money. It's always good, but how do you get it? So back to, so it sounds like, can we have net non-neutrality without SDN and NFV? Does it matter? Is it an irrelevant question?
Well, taking into account that net neutrality is a regulatory aspect, the point is that depends. I mean, the point is that since you can make things much more fine-grained, that you can do things smarter, precisely, probably we could aspire to a more fine-grained net neutrality regulations, in which, well, things could be more flexible in most cases, or could be made much more rigid in others that make sense. And it would not be this general principle of one size fits all that you shall not look what is inside the packet to do anything with it. Yep. Something a little bit that, well, thou shalt look some packets and do something.
Yep.
Probably that's, but for sure, that requires first a much better understanding of what are the possibilities, what are the feasible possibilities in terms of technology,
right?
And well, a much better understanding of which are these possibilities by the regulators, because at the end, it's something that is going to be regulated. And this is something that
No, that's fair. Yeah, it is something that will be regulated. I think that's the one thing that's clear. So back to SDN and NFV. So I think the conclusion is technologies, clever technologies, potentially used by clever or unclever people. Yeah. Well, we don't know, right? It depends, right?
And don't judge about that one.
No, I know. Yeah, I'm going to ask Diego on that one, but
about who's clever.
no. But it seems like from a mechanism standpoint, it exists. But even then, I heard the word Yannis say, IP addresses, right? And the DPI. So SDN NFV doesn't give you the ability to be net non-neutral, and IP addresses and the collection of those IP addresses and the services they represent are still important. True or not?
Well, I think NFV gives you a path to deploy new ways to look at traffic, to classify traffic, to exchange context between the endpoints and the network. This is one of the pushbacks that regulators have a lot of. Like the current way of doing things is that DPI is invasive in terms of privacy.
Yep.
Right.
Could be.
And so,
and
actually, from a regulatory
useless with TLS.
I think from a regulatory perspective, privacy is even more important from net neutrality in terms of what can you do in the network, right? And so I think so far the whole classification has been the network trying to outsmart the endpoints and tell you, hey, I know who you are. I know which application you're coming from. And in practice, this is very hard to do, right? Take an example, you're using Uber, and most of the traffic comes from Google Maps, and the network has no absolute clue that this is Uber traffic. So this is blocking actual partnerships to happen. And NFV and SDN gives you the technical substrate to expose an API in the data plane and then give it to somebody at the endpoint and say, hey, you have a low latency service. I want to get into this low latency service. I'm willing to pay for this, right? If it's, just for this flow, that is critical for me. So I think this is, the more long-term value that SDN and NFV can provide to this context, essentially.
So the ability to push in new classification services or detection services or intelligence services to classify the traffic appropriately, to act on it, I don't know. Yes, no?
Well, I'm a little bit concerned what you say. Of course, we have a lot of opportunities to classify our traffic, but can you imagine if an operator would prioritize Google worse than another Amazon, for example, because they're expecting more money to get from Google. That is not under discussion yet, but there's a possibility to classify the traffic depending where it's coming from, the sources. Is it coming from Google, it comes from Amazon, or coming from BMW as a customer of DT, for example? What about the prioritization? Is that a good idea? Is that a competition game? Or is that a clever use of the opportunity to classify traffic?
So slippery slope, right? So you classify traffic, and I know from a regulatory perspective, classifying application classes is okay. Classifying specific applications may or may not be okay.
I mean, it's happening everywhere.
Well, it is.
Yeah,
it is.
I don't know,
any thoughts?
The question is, what's the granularity? I mean, are we trying to... I'm not an expert on the regulatory framework, so I'm a little uncharted territory here. But I can't imagine the regulators are trying to get down to the flow level or anything of the sort. I think it would be more reasonable to expect, and again, we have maybe some experts here who have better insights than I do, but it'd be more reasonable to think about a more aggregate view of the performance levels that are going to be necessary in order to support the applications. And this might require, instead of testing down at layer 2 and 3, maybe we do have to test at the app service and application layer.
It pretend to be a full app, right?
Exactly.
It's complex, as we were looking at, it's very complex. And so is this a slippery slope that we have to go down regardless? We don't have a choice?
No.
No?
No. I think, the endpoints can just explicitly say, this is who I am and this is what information I want to share with you.
And this
right?
is the QoS I want?
Yes? Yeah. right? And it's up to them to decide how much they disclose and what they do, right? Right now, we're just like, look at the packet. We can get all the information that we want without any consent, without any opt-in from the user and from the application itself.
Yep.
And you can flip this by just like exposing an API and let them decide what to disclose to you.
Yeah, no, that's precisely what, I remember there was a discussion in the ITF on this, precisely, on what it was called path-aware networking, and it's the idea that the endpoints it's the other way around. It's not the network knowing about the endpoints, it's the endpoints knowing about the network.
Correct.
And even you can assume that there is, in most cases, the network is going to trust the endpoints. If you are telling me that what we want is, for example, we made an experiment some time ago with something that we call LOLA, and it's about whether you prefer loss or latency.
Right.
And what you can express is one bit. You say, well, I prefer latency over loss or the other way around. And the point is that, the results were quite curious, because if you were cheating or you were thinking that you were able to cheat the network, it fired back against you, because if you if you really were interested in low loss of packets and you were asking for low latency, your application started to behave much worse than the other case. This is one thing. The second thing is, when it comes to these kind of priorities, something that you can, because it's true that it's tricky, because an application is starting to ask how you mark the packets, how you make the whole process inside. That would slow down the whole thing. But on the other hand, you can some of the ideas that you can follow, for example, a reputation system. You ask whatever, we trust you. You are my customer, I will trust you. From time to time, I will make some checks. And if I catch you, then we will have something to. No, but this works.
So,
something that.
So the answer is not net neutrality, or the answer is a more intelligent network that can provide you the application with the class of service, type of application, class of service that you want.
And depending on the application, not on the network. It's not opening the packets, because
the application tells you.
Being serious with all this coming with quick and all the like, this will become basically impossible in 5-10 years.
So hint-based systems or explicit instructions, right? I mean, not that different from storage architectures, where you hint and you tell the storage architecture or storage systems what kind of information it is. Is it going to be a linear read, or is it going to be a random read, or in the case of the network asking you, do you prefer loss or latency, right? How would you like to die? Run over by a car, or stabbed to the back, right? Something like that. So
basically, and then checking afterwards,
checking after, make sure you're dead.
From time to time, just to what you put with your, I don't know, with your kids. That they are not cheating you. You trust them, but from time to time.
No, I don't trust them, but that's a different story. Agreed. Anything to add on that, Klaus?
No, I think everything is mentioned, but it's valid for the discussion.
Good, excellent. We have a couple minutes, and this is where it gets really exciting, maybe. We're going to open up to the audience. We have about 6-7 minutes. We have a question over there. Do we have mics? Yes, we do have a mic. And she's going to sprint down to you rapidly. So hold your question. If we can do a under 2-hour marathon, we can probably get the mic to you in time. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Vijay. I'm an academic. I've written a few papers about neutrality. I do have very strong opinions, but that's not what I want to talk about.
We want to share the strong opinions.
Yes, but I do think net neutrality is inherently contradictory, and it's abused in all directions in many ways. We violate it every day. If you're running a network, you're regulated. You can't discriminate packets. But if you're a content provider, you can invent a new congestion control protocol, get more out of the network. There's so many contradictions. I don't want to go into it because that would take several hours, right? But the point I want to make is that there's 2 points. One is I'm a consumer. Forget my opinions. I'm a consumer. In my house, I have 2 kids who are gamers. And there's an incredible battle going on in my house because I can't read my email while they're gaming, right? This problem has not been solved by the internet service provider community for years. My kids are teenagers, right? You can imagine the stress in my house. And I think maybe neutrality is stifling innovation in the network. We have had a lot of innovation in the application space. In the early days of the internet, yes, keep the pipe dumb, let the applications innovate. I think the balance has tilted. The applications have had a lot of innovation. In fact, more than half internet traffic is coming from 2 companies in the world. And so I think as a consumer, I'm underserved, and that is stifling innovation in the network. The smart graduates that go out of my university get hired by the application people, not by the internet service providers. So I think there is a huge shift in the industry, which we need to address. And neutrality is something we do seriously need to revisit, right? Yep. So that's one of the points I want to make. The other point, which I'm starting to forget now, was that, yes, I think it's always said, oh, my internet is not working, right? And the blame always falls on the internet service provider.
Right.
The problem is we all agree that different packets have different value. Different applications have different value, but the problem is we can't agree what the value is. So we say, oh, you, the ISP, are going to decide the value, and you're a bad guy, I don't trust you. We have actually done some research. We have some potential frameworks which are worth considering. Can that value be made more explicit in a very explicit and enforceable way? Maybe that removes the suspicion. And coming from Australia, where we have a nationalized access infrastructure, actually I have a choice of 180 internet service providers in my house today, right? So to me, I actually want those internet service providers to be innovative and offering me a great package where my kids can do their gaming and I can do my emailing at the same point, but I want them to be open and explicit about what their policies are. I think that may be a way to address the neutrality problem. So I think I'll stop. There wasn't a question, more a comment, but I really think this system is totally
I'm going to make it a
broken.
question.
We need to
That's my job.
it.
Yeah, I'll make it a question. So question. It seems like we are converging towards the holy grail here, which is that, forget the SDN, NFV, they're just clever technologies, clever methods. Forget the IP addresses and DPI and all that. It seems like what Vijay is saying and what you were actually moving towards is the network needs to be more transparent and open and API-based so that the applications can tell the network what they need, what they want. Vijay's email program can say, I want the highest priority, and please take that QoS down for my sons and daughters who are gaming, right? Is that the answer?
Well, I would make a small comment on this. It's not only the applications, it's the users.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that is important. It's not that I have an application in my mobile that can tell me you are doing X, Y, or Z. It's that I can tell my mobile what I want. Right. And so the applications follow. But this is something that we tend to forget, and it's something that I have very often is about that, well, there is the user and there is the legally owned application or whatever. If my legally owned application is something that I have to consent to almost everything, even to give a free sample of my DNA, right, just to run it. Well, it's legally owned, but it's not a free choice,
Yep.
Yeah.
Understood. Yes. Yeah.
I think it's sort of like looking at the whole debate as a line and say on the one side the network does nothing. It's just like everything is the same packet, right? At the other side is like the network can do whatever they want. They can pick what packets get faster, what packets get slower. And then in the middle there are solutions. So one is category based, another is a user driven like QoS, etc. Actually, my PhD research at Stanford was about user driven control. And one of the results, which is actually deployed right now at Google's home Wi-Fi routers, is that what Vijay said is you can boost like the device that you prefer, yep, and you can give a specific device more bandwidth for like certain time. Right? But what is important, particularly for this community, is that net neutrality is not just for lawyers and regulators, etc. It's for engineers. Right? Trying to give users control means that Telefonica will have 20 million different preferences within their network, right? Yeah. And how you can scale this, how you can authenticate these preferences.
How you can test it and assure it's working correctly. That's going to be hard, maybe.
Right, so I think it's up to the networking community and the engineering community to inform policy on what is possible to do. Right. That combines innovation and competition. Right. And
that's monetization. There's a market element that we haven't talked about, right? Because otherwise, I always have all my TOS bits are favorable, right? Right? Why not, right? But I don't know. Mark, what do you think?
I just have a closing thought. When you get into the regulatory domain, and this is not going to necessarily be about users and applications and the like. It's going to be about compliance. It's going to be about what's the penalty? It's going to be about, maybe I can skirt around the ends. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be a purely idealistic, let's have the best performing network and achieve all the theoretical goals. It's going to really come down to
it's going to mix
the letter of the law, so
I
to
think
speak.
you're a little bit unfair to them. I start getting involved with regulators, and I see that they are very, very hungry for real-world implementation stuff outside, the lobbying things that they've been bombarded with. That's my, experience so far.
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, take it with a grain of salt. But
No, I mean, no, well, this is a normal situation in which, I mean, how to say it?
politely.
Politely and in a way, no. I mean, it's about who watches the watchman and things like that. I mean, the problem is that once you define a body that is dedicated to a particular task, especially when it's a control task, I mean, that body, and this is not the fault of that human beings, because it's a fault of the human nature. That body tends to perpetuate itself as having to watch even when you don't need to be watching again. And they tend to invent, and this is something that probably when you are a part of an operator, you see the same way. With how sweet times were when we were a monopoly, and that's, well, let's go back to that. This is, we're not talking about this. That's precisely, I mean, let me say this, I believe that at the end, but at the end, it's not about, let me say this, it's not about network and applications, because at the end, is about precisely providers of whatever the services and users. And it's about empowering the users, because at the end, for the beginning, it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for all of us.
Right.
Probably, and that's, let me talk in favor of us. We are more used to be uncomfortable than others in that space. So we would welcome uncomfort or uncomfortability for everyone, just for the sake of the user.
No, I think that's fair. So with that, actually, we're out of time, but I'm going to let Klaus have the final words, if you will. So thoughts about, so we've had a discussion. We've talked about net neutrality. We've talked about net non-neutrality. We've talked about SDN, NFV. We've talked about the fact that these are clever technologies. DPI is not always good, all that. We're now back at a space which seems like if we just made the network more intelligent and we embrace that and brought in users, applications, right, intelligence around those, and some kind of monetization capabilities, that we potentially could solve the problem. Does that even make sense? Or have we been here before and we never took it further?
I think not always is it good that we are using this technology possible to use. That means network neutralization. It can be delivered by NFV and by SDN for sure. But is it useful from a customer point of view? It's a completely different question. I think we should discuss it more carefully as we're doing it today.
Fair enough. We'll go ask the customer. We'll get VJ on the stage and ask the customer. I know what he wants. It's the same thing I want. I want all gaming shut off permanently. Anyway, so with that, we're going to move on to the next one. But thank you, panel. That's a round of applause. Appreciate it. And